Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. I do have one quick favor before we get to the video that you came here for, and that is very simply this. You see that little red subscribe button below this video? Go ahead, smash that subscribe button. It really does help me. It really does help this channel grow and my audience grow. So go ahead and hit that red subscribe button. And now, here is the video that you came here for. We are under 70 days until the first major Saturday of the college football season. This past Saturday was 10 Saturdays until week 1. And so what I want to do today is hit on the 7 biggest storylines, or the 7 biggest games in week 0 and week 1 of the college football season. College football is, first of all, we got to just start talking college football because we got to get ready because the season is about to be here. What I tried to do last week was hit on the biggest storylines. Today we'll hit on the biggest games. But also I want to hit on the biggest games because college football might be the only sport that opening night really does matter. You look at, say, the NFL. If the Dallas Cowboys lose in week 1 to the Giants or the Eagles or the Broncos or whoever, their season isn't over, and it's not to say that any college football team season is over, but week 1 really does tell you a lot, and if you lose in week 1, you fall behind the 8 ball in whatever goal it is, whether it is to make the playoff, whether it is to get to a major bowl game, whether it is to get bowl eligible. And so these week 1 games really do matter. And so with that said, what I want to do, I want to go through right now the 7 biggest games. And 7's a little bit of an arbitrary number, but I think there's 7 really important ones in week 0 or week 1 of the college football season. Let's get into it. Number 7. The 7th biggest game, in my opinion, is not actually in week 1. It is actually in week 0. And if you follow college football, you know that the college football gods love us. And while that first Saturday, Labor Day weekend, is really the opening weekend of college football, we do get a couple big games on week 0, a weekend before. Last year we had Nebraska versus Illinois. We had UCLA versus Hawaii. This year, Nebraska is back for week 0 after the disaster that was last year. They are playing Northwestern in Dublin. And when I tell you this is like low-key one of the most important games of, I don't want to say the season, but this one's really important. Week 0, this is the marquee game, and this is why it's important. From Northwestern's perspective, look, Northwestern's an awesome program. Pat Fitzgerald is great. They were disappointing last year, but don't forget, they won the Big Ten 2 years ago, played Ohio State in the Big Ten championship game. But Nebraska, they are a completely different deal, and I don't know how much you remember about Nebraska last year. I think I mentioned it last week. They went 3-9 overall, but here's the catch. They go 3-9, but all 9 losses are by 9 points or less. 8 of the losses are by 7 points or less. Here is some of Nebraska's scores from last season. They played Michigan State at Michigan State. Remember, Michigan State wins 11 games, goes to the Fiesta Bowl, beats Pitt. Nebraska loses by 3 in overtime. They lose by 7 to Michigan, a team that made the college football playoff. They lose by 9 to Ohio State, a team that won 11 games in the Rose Bowl. And oh, by the way, they were driving to take the lead with like 4 minutes left in that game. They lose by 7 to Oklahoma, 7 to Wisconsin, 7 to Iowa. So they were right on the cusp every single game last year, and they just couldn't get over the hump, finishing 3-9. It was historic how many, and that's not like hyperbole. Like, it was literally, they were the first team ever to lose 9 games by 9 points or less, 8 games by 7 points or less. And so I bring it up because the offseason and really the end of last season was very interesting for Scott Frost. He was brought back for another year despite 0 bowl games and really 0 momentum, simply because it was impossible not to watch that team and say, they're right on the cusp. Let's give this guy another year to figure it out. Now, where it gets interesting is this, is that he first of all, to his credit, Scott Frost did kind of revamp the program in the offseason, did very well in the portal, all things considering. They got Casey Thompson, former starting quarterback at Texas. He appears to have the inside track to be Nebraska's starting quarterback. Adrian Martinez has finally left Nebraska. Also got one of the elite defensive players in the portal, O'Shan Mathis from TCU, that was thought to be going to Texas. He ends up in Nebraska instead. So Scott Frost did everything that you could in the offseason to really get this program back on track. But at some point, you got to play games and you got to win. And so why this one is important is because if you lose this one, it doesn't get any easier once the season starts, and it's not one of those, like, if you lose this one, we kind of expect, oh, you'll bounce back next week and be fine. No, they have Oklahoma on the schedule. They have Michigan on the schedule. They obviously have the teams in the Big Ten West who are tough, Iowa and Wisconsin. And what is especially important with this game and with Scott Frost is the following. If you lose this game, Scott Frost, like I said, he got he got another season. Everybody thought he was going to be fired at the end of last year. But his buyout gets cut in half October 1st. So if you lose this game, you got Oklahoma in the end of the month, and there is a possibility this guy does not survive October if he does not win this game. So forget the season. Scott Frost, you got to win this game. Nebraska, Northwestern, that is actually the game that headlines week 0 of the college football season. Let's get to number 6, and I think a very interesting one. We go from week 0 to the final game of week 1. Remember, week 1 is Labor Day weekend. We start games on Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and we play Monday night on Labor Day. And the game this year, Monday night on Labor Day, is Clemson playing Georgia Tech in Atlanta. Now, technically, this is a quote-unquote neutral site game. It isn't on Georgia Tech's campus. It's instead at the Mercedes-Benz Stadium where the Atlanta Falcons play. But this one, to me, is fascinating for all of the reasons that you already know what I'm about to say. Now, from Georgia Tech's perspective, I don't think there's very much interesting. I feel bad for Jeff Collins, their head coach, but he's in year 4. It has not improved. His best player, Jahmyr Gibbs, transfers to Alabama. I think he's going to be out at the end of the year. But from Clemson's perspective, we talked about it last week in the biggest storylines. This is a program that needs to start building up momentum again. Last year was by no means a disaster. They finished 10-3, but by the standard for which Clemson has set in college football, it is we win the ACC, we go to the playoff, and we compete for national championships. Last year, they start 4-3. They lose opening night to Georgia. To their credit, they rallied at the end of the year. They won their final 6 games, but none of that matters if it doesn't bring momentum back into this season and get Clemson back to the top of the ACC competing for a college football playoff berth. Why week 1 is especially important? It's pretty straightforward. We get to see, has Clemson improved? Was last year a weird thing where they didn't have the quarterback and there was too many injuries and they had a little bit of attrition? Or is this a declining program? And where I think it matters is, and where we'll see it in week 1, is what I just said, at the quarterback position. Remember, DJ Uiagalelei, we talked about him last week in the biggest storylines. I don't root against any individual players. But this was a kid that last season completed 55% of his passes, 9 touchdowns, 10 interceptions. And Dabo Swinney, to his credit, said all the right things this offseason. It's his job, blah, 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 blah. None of us believe him. The bottom line is this year, Clemson actually has help at the quarterback position in ways that they haven't in the past. They have the 5-star freshman, Cade Klubnik. They have a transfer named Hunter Johnson who actually began his career at Clemson, went to Northwestern, and has transferred back. And I think DJ's got a really short leash. Doesn't mean that he's going to be pulled in this one. I think Clemson wins convincingly. But if he has those tendencies, if he plays the way that he did late last season and really throughout last season, Dabo's going to have a tough decision to make. And remember, say this about Dabo. You can criticize him for this, for that. When there's a tough decision to make at quarterback, if there's a better guy on the roster, he'll make that decision. Remember, Trevor Lawrence, Kelly Bryant, you remember that whole situation 4 or 5 years ago? Kelly Bryant's the starting quarterback, led Clemson to a playoff. Then they got this kid, Trevor Lawrence. In week 4, Dabo says, yeah, I'm sorry, senior that's been with me for 4 years, but we're putting in the freshman. Could we see that again this year? I don't think it happens in week 1. But I do think if DJ struggles, that call is going to start to happen. And it's also worth noting one other thing as well. What happens if Clemson absolutely blows this team out and Dabo puts in Cade Klubnik in mop-up time and he looks awesome? All things to consider, Clemson, Georgia Tech is that Monday night game, the final game of Labor Day weekend, and you talk about a fascinating game. That one is it. Number 5, 7 p.m. Eastern, Saturday, opening Saturday of the college football season. This one is really interesting. This is one of the ones that I am looking forward to more than any. Utah, the defending Pac-12 champ. Remember, they went to the Rose Bowl and almost beat Ohio State, final score 48-45 in one of the all-time classics. They travel to Florida and the Swamp to face Billy Napier, the new Florida head coach, replacing Dan Mullen in his first game. And you talk about juicy storylines from both perspectives. This one is right up there amongst all of them. Here's why. First of all, from Utah's perspective, yes, they won the Pac-12. They did lose quite a bit on defense, but they bring back a lot of the offense that was really clicking late in the season. If you remember, Utah was basically a juggernaut at the end of last season. They played, they obviously, as I said, they played in the Rose Bowl, but here were their final few weeks. Remember, they played Oregon at home late in the year. They win 38-7. They play Oregon in the Pac-12 championship game. They win 38-10. They go to the Rose Bowl against Ohio State and put up 45 points. So they bring back a ton on offense. But why this is important is because it's something I've talked about quite a bit. I mentioned a few weeks ago, kind of had a lunch kind of meeting, whatever, with somebody kind of pretty high up in the Pac-12, talked with another assistant coach late last week in the Pac-12. And while there's a new commissioner and there's new excitement and there's new this, there's new that, everybody in Pac-12 country, and as I think everybody listening knows this, I do in fact live in Pac-12 country. I live right outside Los Angeles. Everybody in Pac-12 country agrees. If we want national respect, we have to go win the games that matter on a national stage. And so Florida is by no means one of the best teams in the SEC this year. But if your best team in the Pac-12 cannot go to the Swamp and not beat Florida, it's again, nobody's going to sit there and be like, oh, Utah's terrible, they're overrated. But Florida's probably the 7th, 8th, 9th best team in the SEC this year. If you can't go on the road and win as maybe the first or second best team in the Pac-12, I think there's a lot of people that are going to question, are we going to get another year without a real contender in the Pac-12, and how good and how deep is this league? From Florida's perspective, it's really important. And I'll say this, we're going to talk about Billy Napier maybe a little bit later in this show. But Billy Napier, the new head coach at Florida, I like him. Everything I've read, I know some people that have worked for him. They love him. They swear by him. Really organized, really detail-oriented. I believe that he is going to be a major step up at Florida. But it has been a bad few weeks. He kind of publicly, there were a few players that essentially got cut from the team last week. He does this weird open letter thing where he apologizes to the fans and tells them to be patient. It's like, bro, it's year one. You don't need it. It's not even year one. It's the offseason heading into year one. You don't need to be apologizing for anything. Run the program the way you want to. Do what you think is best. But you have that situation. The recruiting hasn't gone quite as well as Gators fans had hoped. And so for Billy Napier, I'll just say this. The schedule for Florida is absolutely brutal. And if you lose this one, it's only going to get tougher. They play, obviously, the normal schedule. They play Kentucky in week 2 in the Swamp. They play at Tennessee by the end of September. You could potentially be looking at 1-3, 2-3 by the end of September. And then you have 2 cross-division games, LSU at home, and you draw Texas A&M this year, which is not an easy draw. So Florida, Billy Napier, to calm the locals, I would certainly say that it would be important to win this game. Number 4, another really interesting game that I think is a little bit under the radar right now, the Cincinnati Bearcats. Don't forget, Cincinnati went to the college football playoff last year. There's only 4 teams that made the playoff. Cincinnati was one of them. They travel to Fayetteville, Arkansas, to face the Arkansas Razorbacks coming off a 9-win season. Why this is important is because both of these programs are coming off really successful seasons, and I think both programs do not feel like they got the respect they deserve. So what do you got to do to get respect? You go out and take it. From Arkansas's perspective, listen, 9-win season, it was awesome. You beat Texas at home in one of the great home environments in all of college football last year. You, on top of that, you beat Texas A&M in Dallas. You beat LSU in a rivalry game. You beat Penn State in a bowl game. But go ahead and read all the preview magazines. Go ahead and read whatever. Nobody's giving Arkansas any love. Everybody's saying, it was this, it was that. LSU's going through a coaching change. You want respect, and maybe more importantly, you don't want to lose respect. This is a game you got to win at home. The schedule by Arkansas standards is actually much more manageable this year than it has been in the past, but it's still really tough, Arkansas fans, and I know you're listening. It's still really tough because it's funny because Sam Pittman over the last 2 years, he has said in SEC Media Days in back-to-back years, he has said, we are the national champions in toughest schedules. 2 years ago in the SEC-only COVID season, they did not play out of conference games. Arkansas got Georgia and Florida. Last year they had to play Georgia at Georgia in a national championship season. This year you look at the schedule, it is in some ways more manageable than it has been in the past. You have a tough out-of-conference slate with Cincinnati. You have a tough out-of-conference slate with a game at BYU in the middle of the season, and then Hugh Freeze and Liberty come in late in the year. But you do get LSU at home. You do get Bama at home. You do get Texas A&M on a neutral field. I find it very interesting from Arkansas's perspective. Their first 5 games, there is not a single true road game among them. And then their final 4 games, they have 3 in a row at home. But the point is, if you're Arkansas, if you want respect, if you want to keep building on this, you got to take care of Cincinnati at home. And I think Cincinnati's the exact opposite perspective. Never forget that Cincinnati is a program that, yes, they're coming off a college football playoff appearance, but they're also a team that 1 year from now is headed to the Big 12. And so when it comes to the Cincinnati program at this particular moment in time, what I would say, I don't think most people really think like Cincinnati's they lost a lot. If you remember, we talked about this after the NFL draft. I believe it was the second or third most draft picks from any school. Georgia was number 1 with 15. Cincinnati was number 2 in terms of draft picks from the – I'm tripping over my own words here. Cincinnati's got me flustered. Cincinnati was the second most draft picks of any school in college football this year behind only Georgia. That is right. They had I take that back. Third behind Georgia and LSU. But they had more draft picks than Alabama. They had more draft picks than Florida State, than Miami, than whoever. They lose a lot. But you're going to the Big 12 next year. You're going to be facing teams like Arkansas quite a bit on the schedule going forward. And if you get embarrassed at home, or on the road, it's probably not a great sign about how ready you are for the Big 12 a year from now. Let's keep it going. Top 3 biggest games left on the Indy college football schedule in terms of biggest games going into week 1. These are the biggest week 1 games and week 0 games of the college football season. Number 3, it's the big one. This is the biggest one from a, marquee brand name perspective. But in some ways, I don't know really how interesting it is. I think it's either really interesting or not interesting at all. That is Notre Dame opening up at Ohio State. Why it's obviously interesting? Game 1 of the Marcus Freeman era. I know by technicality he coached the bowl game, but I think we all kind of look at this as the beginning of Marcus Freeman as the face of Notre Dame football, facing his alma mater. His alma mater, by the way, who he kind of talked a little bit of trash about a few weeks ago when he was talking about this game, and he said, our academics are different at Notre Dame than Ohio State. Obviously upset Ohio State fans. I don't blame you, Ohio State fans. But this one's big, but it's not big. And here's why I don't know how big it is. I don't know how big it is because I don't think most people really think that Notre Dame is going to go into Columbus and get a victory. And so if this game goes down the way that we think it does, it's about a 14.5 point spread right now. If this is Ohio State 34, Notre Dame 14, I don't really know how much that we learn about either of these teams. But where it gets interesting, what happens if it's close? What happens if Notre Dame pulls off the upset? That's where it gets really interesting to me for a couple reasons. One, if Notre Dame pulls off the upset or even keeps it close, I do think Buckeyes fans are concerned. Remember, Ohio State is coming off a disappointing end to last season. You lose to Michigan. You don't win the Big Ten for the first time in forever. You go to the Rose Bowl. That's great for Buckeye fans, but that is not where you want it to be. You want to be in the college football playoff, competing against Alabama, Georgia, etc., not playing against Utah in the Rose Bowl. Well, if this game's close, it means one of two things. The offense isn't nearly as good as we thought it was, or probably more realistically, the defense, led by new defensive coordinator Jim Knowles, who came from Oklahoma State, maybe that defense isn't quite as good as we thought it was. And so that's where it gets interesting, is one, what if it's really close? Ohio State's probably worried. If Ohio State loses, they're very worried about the state of the defense. I'd also say it from the opposite perspective. Notre Dame, if they get blown out, I do think it might be a sign to be a little bit worried about the Notre Dame Fighting Irish this year, and let me explain why. Notre Dame, listen, I like Brian Kelly. I don't really understand why everybody doesn't like him. I mean, I don't think he's got a great personality, but I'm not trying to take him out for drinks at the bar. I'm happily married. I got a wife. I'm just trying to watch football games here. Why? People criticize Brian Kelly, but he kind of set the standard over the last 3, 4, 5 years. It's compete for college football playoff, go 11-1, 12-0, compete at the highest level of the sport, even if you're not quite Alabama, Ohio State, or one of those programs. Well, if Ohio State wins this game in dominant fashion and Notre Dame has to go back to South Bend with its tail between its legs, I do think it sets up for an interesting year with Notre Dame. Now, I think Marcus Freeman was the right hire. He's the guy that I would have gone with in that moment in time, of course, assuming that Luke Fickell wasn't coming, which he wasn't. Where I'd be concerned, though, is this. Notre Dame has a very tough schedule this year by Notre Dame standards, and I do think those of you who say that Notre Dame's schedule is kind of most years, I kind of agree with you. Well, this year, it's no joke. They open at Ohio State. By the end of September, they do play at North Carolina, which I think will be improved this year. After that, they play they play BYU on a neutral field. They play Clemson late in the year, and they play at USC late in the season. So let me just kind of contextualize that again. Open versus at Ohio State. Clemson in the middle of the season at home. Close at USC with North Carolina, BYU, and a couple other tough games on the schedule. I'm not saying it's Auburn in the SEC West here. But what I am saying is it's tougher by comparison than previous years. And if Marcus Freeman starts his first year 8-4, there's going to be questions over whether Brian Kelly was the right guy, whether Marcus Freeman was ready for the job, whatever. So you want to get off on the right foot if you're Ohio State. Quickly, let's get to the top two. The second one, I think you could have had it a little bit lower down the list. Whatever. It's my list. I am super intrigued by Georgia versus Oregon in Atlanta on that first Saturday in college football. And this is another one kind of like Ohio State, Notre Dame, right? If this goes exactly as planned, then I don't really know that there's going to be much to talk about coming out of this one. Georgia's about a 17-point favorite. They're playing Oregon. Oregon, of course, new head coach Dan Lanning. I don't really know that it's that interesting if it goes as planned. And Georgia, despite losing an NFL record 15 draft picks in this NFL draft, still has plenty of talent. It's in their backyard. They will be comfortably favored. And I'm not dumb enough to bet against Georgia in this game. Where it could potentially get interesting, though, is in a couple different places. Again, like Ohio State, Notre Dame, if it's close, if Georgia somehow loses, think about what the narratives are coming out of that game. Well, Georgia got lucky last year. Georgia really can't win with Stetson Bennett. If all those injuries don't happen to Alabama, Georgia doesn't beat Alabama last year, and it's just another year of whatever. That's what people are going to be talking about if they somehow lose to Oregon. And even if they don't, even if it's close, even if it's competitive, I think Georgia fans would be a little bit worried knowing what's ahead in the SEC, even though Oregon probably might be actually maybe the best team on Georgia's regular season schedule this year. Which brings me to Oregon. Why this is interesting. Nobody expects them to win in Atlanta. But remember, Mario Cristobal left Oregon last December to take the Miami job. And when he left, in that going away locker room speech, he said to all his guys, he said, I know this is tough. I'm going home, but I don't want you guys leaving here. I don't want you guys following me. I don't want you guys hitting the portal because in this locker room, we have a team good enough to win the national championship. Trust in the next guy. Trust in your university. You came here to win a national championship. There is enough talent in this locker room to do so. And so that's where it gets very interesting to me, is when I look at this whole situation with Georgia, with Oregon. Oregon's got a lot of talent. And could this be the second year in a row where they go into somebody's backyard? Remember, they won at Ohio State last year. I don't think they beat Georgia, but they got a lot of talent on that roster, and I would not be surprised if they keep it close. Finally, number one, I'm going long. It's what I do. The number one most interesting game to me. I think if you ask most people that cover college football, they probably would not list this game number one, but to me it's the most interesting. It's that Sunday night game. Remember, Labor Day weekend, we get games on Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and then there's no NFL on Sunday, and Monday night we get college football. We already talked about Monday night, Georgia Tech plays Clemson. Sunday night, the game that we get this year is LSU versus Florida State. And on paper, you'd sit there and say, there's no way that is bigger than Georgia, Oregon. No way it's bigger than Ohio State, Notre Dame. But it's interesting, though. It's not bigger because neither team's going to win a national championship, but the most interesting, important games, I think the narratives in this game are huge. First of all, LSU, we know it's year one under Brian Kelly. We know nobody expects them to compete at the highest level this coming season. The last time we saw LSU, they had 39 players or something in their bowl game. But this is also LSU. They just ran off a coach that won a national championship less than 24 months after he won a title. His name was Coach O. We're going to miss him this year. So when I look at this situation, Why this is so important to me is as follows. If LSU loses this game, with their schedule in the SEC West and a tough cross-division schedule, I don't know if they're getting to 6 wins in a bowl game. If they lose this game to a Florida State team who we'll discuss in a minute, I will be very worried about them if I'm an LSU fan winning the games needed to have a respectable first year under Brian Kelly. Because here is their schedule. They obviously play Alabama. We know that. They play Ole Miss at home. But Mississippi State, I think, is actually kind of a good team this year. We'll talk about them at some point in this fall. But they also play at Auburn. They play at Florida. They play at Arkansas. They play at A&M. And keep this in mind. Their cross-division games, I just told you, at Florida in the Swamp. And they play Tennessee, which is very improved this year. And so if LSU loses this game, find me the 6 definitive wins on their schedule, because Florida State is, I don't even think Florida State is where like Auburn is right now. I don't think they're where Mississippi State is right now. If you don't win this one, I think you're having trouble beating Mississippi State, Auburn, let alone at Texas A&M, Alabama, schools like that. For Florida State's perspective, I think it's equally as fascinating for this reason. Do you remember what the offseason was like at Florida State? This is year 3 for Mike Norvell. Year 1 was a disaster, but it was COVID. Last year, you start 0-4. To his credit, he turned things around. The Seminoles went 5-3 in their final 8 games of the season. Although they could have beaten Florida with an interim head coach to go to a bowl game, and they did not. So there's already a little bit of pressure on Mike Norvell. Are you really the guy? But more importantly, do you remember what happened on signing day? When Florida State, you go through all the crap of the last few years, multiple coaching changes, all these losses, but the one saving grace was you have the number 1 high school player in America, Travis Hunter, a cornerback committed to you. Well, what happened on signing day? Not only does he decommit, not only does he go to another school, he goes to an FCS school called Jackson State. And Jackson State is coached by Florida State's most prominent alum, Deion Sanders. And so just think about, if you're a Florida State fan right now, how much patience do you have for Mike Norvell if you lose this game? Losing season, 5-7 last year, lose to your rival on the final day. You lose the number 1 recruit in the country to an FCS HBCU school coached by your most prominent alum. And you lose to LSU in Brian Kelly's first game in a make-or-break year. Ooh, buddy, I'm telling you, that is a big one.